In the last lectures, we had a look at JSON data and at importing data from the web from a RESTful API, for example. I now want to conclude this module by having a look at how we can get data from a database, specifically from a MySQL database. And for that, we of course need a MySQL database. Now, feel free to skip this video where I set up the database and fill it with some dummy data if you already do have a MySQL database to connect with. So what I will do in the case that you don't have one, I'll go to mysql.com, and since MySQL is free, you can run your own MySQL database for free. We can go to downloads and choose the community edition, which you can find at the bottom here. Now then on the left, you may choose MySQL on Windows and download the MySQL installer to quickly get going with MySQL and installing it on your Windows machine. Of course, MySQL also runs on Linux. And this is just an example because you probably are using a Windows machine if you're working with Power BI. So let's download this installer, or click on the link first. And then at the bottom, you can choose between two options. The first one simply is the web installer. Here, all the required files will be downloaded during the installation process. The second one is the all is in the installer already alternative. Now, since I won't install all features, I'll go with the web downloader, the first version here. And you're prompted to log in, but you actually don't have to. You can just click on no thanks, just start my download. Now, this will download the installer, obviously, and once it did finish, I'll walk through it together with you. So the download finished. Let's now run the installer, hit run. And now in the installer, we of course have to accept the license terms. And here I recommend choosing custom so that you can customize what will get installed. You can click next. And now what do we need? We of course need a MySQL server, so the server running our database. And just to make this really clear, this server will run on our local machine for testing purposes because we need a database to connect to. Of course, in a real scenario, that is going to run on a server, on a place in the internet somewhere. So here, let's go to MySQL server and choose the version which is appropriate for your operating system, add it to the list of to be installed features. We should also have a look at applications though, because whilst we do not need the majority of these, the workbench is pretty handy to be installed because that is a tool running on our local machine which allows us to administer our database. So if you want to add some dummy data, add some tables, that is a tool we definitely want to use. So let's also add this to the list. And with that, we're done for now. You can now hit next. And here you can choose a place where to install it. Once you adjusted this to your needs, you can hit next again. And it will now install the two features or applications we selected. Now, since I chose the web installer, it'll start by downloading these packages and then it'll install them. I'll be back once this is finished. The installation did complete for me, so I can hit next. And now we can configure the MySQL server. So let's hit next and let's choose the standalone server. We certainly don't want to set up a cluster here on our local machine. Here, these settings should be fine too. Remember the port number. We're going to need it later when we connect to the database, and tick show advanced options so that we can configure a little bit more and walk through the full setup process. Next again, and now we need to define a root password. Of course, our database is password protected, so choose a password, which you of course should remember thereafter. And once you did this, you can click next. You could add more users, but you don't really need to do that. In a real scenario, you probably do have multiple database users, but here having the root user is all we need. And we can click OK on this screen here, where we decide how it should run on our Windows machine. We can click next here too. Click next here on the advanced options too. You could set up some logging if you wanted to do that. And then click execute. And now it will apply our configuration, start the server, and do all the things it needs to do so that we have a running MySQL server. I'll be back once this is finished. It did finish, so I can click finish. And now we can actually click next one more time and then start the MySQL workbench. This tool we can use to administer the database. So let's hit finish here. And it starts up the workbench. We can now connect to our database by clicking on it. And here we should enter that password you gave that root user. So I'll do that. And with that, we're connected to our database server. And that's important, to our database server. Now we can add a new schema, which technically is like a new database on our database server, because that's really important. It's a database server, not just one database. So let's click this new schema button here, and I will name it PBI test and click apply to create this schema. You can now click finish and you have this new like database on your bottom here. It has no tables though, so let's add a new table with this button here. And we have to select a default schema by clicking right on it and then set as default schema. Now click the new table button. Here you can see the schema which was selected. And in this new table, you can give it any test name. So I'll name it PBI data, and that of course is totally up to you. Now you can actually drag this down so that you can add columns, because of course you want to have columns in your database table which will structure your data. You typically have an ID column, which is an integer, which is your primary key and not null, so make sure these two are checked. Then I'll add a new column, I'll name it region, and this can be a varchar with 45 characters, which basically is a string up to 45 characters long. It should also not be null. And of course, if I increase that, you can configure way more, right? If you're an SQL expert, definitely go ahead and go full nuts on that. I just want to set up a basic testing database. I'll therefore add a last column, the volume for our sales like this, and that could be a decimal number. We can change the type here, but I'll just make it an integer since I will use full whole numbers. I'll set this to not null too, and then click apply. And here you see the SQL command which will be executed. And if you know how to write SQL, you can of course write your own commands. So I'll click apply here and finish. And now you see that this new table was added. It is empty though, of course. And one quick and easy way of adding data is to right click it, select the rows. Of course, there are other ways too of importing data and so on. And here in the selected rows, we can now actually start adding rows. So I'll do this. I'll add a new row with the ID 1. Here the region could be China with a volume of 100. 2 could be the USA with 120. Maybe name it USA like that though. 3 could be India with 110. And then maybe one last one. Since I live there, choose your country, of course, Germany 80, something like that. Doesn't really matter, it's just for testing purposes so that we have some data to work with. With that, we can click apply. Here you see the insert statements which will be executed, and hit apply again. And with that, you got a running MySQL server with your own table, your own database, and your own data in that table. And with that, in the next lecture, we can actually connect to that service, to that database server, and the database in the database server with Power BI.